Hello everybody and welcome to the Gaming Grappler. For today's video, I'm going to be giving you guys the premium Dune Part 2 review. But before I take a look forward, I'm going to take a look back at Dune Part 1. Both of these movies in their entirety cover all of the material from the first book made by Frank Herbert. And I kind of feel that in order to judge the story as a whole, we got to take a look back. And Dune Part 1 was hated for being slow-paced and long. Now, me personally, I signed up for that slow-paced setting. I love Dark Souls and post-apocalyptic settings, and I kind of feel like the universe of Dune fits that kind of vibe. I personally enjoyed Part 1 for taking its time and letting me feel a part of its world. Dune introduced me to a lot of science fiction concepts that I didn't know I needed in my life. I love a future where technology is simultaneously super advanced, but without the use of artificial intelligence or computing systems. This is a universe where they have the technology to warp around the universe faster than the speed of light, but they don't have the computers to calculate or direct that technology. There is a human being literally in the driver's seat of everything, and that creates an interesting type of vibe and setting. Warfare has also, in a strange way, reverted back to the Bronze Age. Thanks to the invention of shields, long-ranged weapons have been reverted to a secondary role in comparison to melee weapons. The result is a future that puts an emphasis on human beings and their struggles in warfare. After all, you can't really tell a story about suffering and war and the effect it has on people if it's just drones and AIs hacking each other to death. Like, there's really not much going on there. Dune Part 1 does make some mistakes there. I kind of feel like the guild navigators should have been showcased a lot more in Part 1, because we understand that spice is an important resource for space travel, but we never get the context as to why it's so important for space travel, and the movie should have gone into detail to showcase this point. And for those that don't know, this is how space travel works in Dune. Since we don't have computers or AI systems, in order to calculate traveling through space without hitting a meteorite or some form of debris, a human being needs to get high off of spice to the point that they can predict the future so that they could safely direct a ship. That's kind of how it works. The movies never really explain this, but I kind of feel like it's important to understand what's going on. The setting of Arrakis is also pretty amazing. It's a desert planet so hot that water itself is worshipped as a religious resource. Religion is also thematically important because of the nature of the desert. After all, besides still suits and recycling water, there's only so much a human being can do to survive. Faith is needed in this kind of environment. You need hope to keep you going above all else. And finally, Dune Part 2 is about 1,000 times better than Part 1. It's not even funny. Like, in retrospect, Dune Part 1 just feels like an overly created 2-hour introductory sequence for Part 2. Like, Part 1 feels like ground zeros to Phantom Pain. It's kind of insane in retrospect. But let's get on with the actual review for Part 2. And I kind of wanted to start with the casting, and all of the actors seem to be competently cast, at least most of them. Even actors like Josh Brolin and Zendaya, who can be easily mistaken for their Marvel roles, feel more like Dune characters in this movie. Timothée Chalamet is pretty much the perfect casting for his role in this movie. His character also has a more direct and leading role in the story this time around, and his character has an interesting arc that I'll get into later, but it should be known he sells it completely this time around. The only actor who feels cartoonishly miscast is Emperor Christopher Walken. And I kind of love it. I love how cartoonishly miscast he was, because I love experiencing my headcanon that, yes, Christopher Walken is the God Emperor of space, and I can't unhear his voice in my head. But I digress. Let's actually get into the meat potatoes of this review and talk about the plot for Dune 2. Dune has a really simple and well-executed plot. Paul Atreides has been put at his lowest point at the start of this movie. His father has been assassinated, along with the entirety of his house, besides his Bene Gesserit mother, who escaped alongside him at the ending of Dune Part 1. He has been cast out into the desert to die, and his only hope of survival is to work alongside the Freemen. The power of the Freemen comes from learning to live in the harsh conditions of the desert. These harsh conditions have made them powerful warriors. And Paul, at first glance in this movie, goes through a typical hero's journey, like right down to a T. He learns the ways of the desert, he learns to survive on his own, he learns how to fight, and he develops a relationship with Chani, who is a native freeman. He also conquers a dragon, riding the sandworm. But where this deviates from a typical hero's journey is that Paul's legend of being a chosen one has all been fabricated and engineered through generations of Bene Gesserit propaganda. The Lisan al-Galib, or the Kwisatz Haderach, oh my god, I can't believe I got that in this take, is more of a product of selective breeding and training than divine intervention. All of Paul's demigod-like abilities have some kind of scientific explanation behind them. Being able to see into the future is not a divine ability, but something anyone can gain from spice exposure. His knowledge of the desert wasn't innate or something he was born with, but something he studied and practiced on his own free time. And it's not like he studied it for no reason. House Atreides was supposed to rule Arrakis. Of course he would study it. Being able to control people with the sound of his voice isn't a superpower, but a Bene Gesserit technique that theoretically anyone could learn through training. His hero's journey is mostly just used as a front to control the Fremen. The more Paul succeeds in the desert and his guerrilla war against the Harkonnens, the more people start to worship him as a religious figure. Paul is kind of a tragic character in this movie. He doesn't really want to take up the mantle of being a religious icon or a messianic figure. His initial motivations are noble. He wants revenge on the people who murdered his family and his house. He genuinely likes the Fremen. He studied them for years and has a deep respect for their culture. He wants the Fremen to succeed, but Paul understands that becoming a demigod-like figure to these people will lead him down a path of ruin in the long term. But the tragic thing about Paul Atreides is that he's forced into this role by forces completely outside of his control. His own mother is spreading propaganda and controlling him like a puppet on strings, and his close friends like Stilgar desperately want him to be their messiah. And the escalation of war backs Paul into a corner where he has no choice but to become the man in his visions. And that is a tragic Greek story right there. The plot of Dune Part 2 doesn't just work as a hero's journey, it's a well-executed Greek tragedy. But what about the characters? After all, you can have the best plot in the world, but it's not going to make a difference if you don't care about the people taking part of that plot. And thankfully, the characters in Dune Part 2 are phenomenal. And I'm going to start that character breakdown with the main character, Paul Atreides. And Paul had such a brilliant character arc in this movie. In Part 1, Paul isn't even an active player in his own movie. He just merely responds to outside forces. He gets pushed around by the Reverend Mother, Gurney pushes him around, and he spends most of the movie in someone else's shadow, whether it's his father Leto Atreides or Duncan Idaho, who styles on Sardaukar forces. Also, his main role in Part 1 is just to run away and escape the Harkonnens. It's kind of lame in retrospect. In Part 2, Paul Atreides' character is the complete opposite to how he behaved in Part 1. Part 2, Paul takes on a more active and leading role pretty much right from the start of the movie. Paul is shown right from the get-go to be a bit of a schemer, and he actually has a pretty concrete plan on how he wants to get revenge against the Harkonnens. Paul's plan, that he outright states to his mother Jessica at the start of the movie, is to get an army of Fremen soldiers to run a guerrilla war against the Harkonnens. To gain their trust, Paul outright states that he will live up to the prophecy of being the Lisan al-Galib. And the Lisan al-Galib, also known as the Kwisatz Haderach, is this artificial religious figure that was implanted on Arrakis through decades of Bene Gesserit propaganda. And the Fremen are highly susceptible to believing in religious figures, due mostly to the fact that the harsh living conditions of the desert kind of breed a religious and faith-based mindset. Again, there's only so much you can do to stop yourself from dying of thirst. You can create a still suit, you can mine for water, but for the most part, you're just hoping and praying to come across some form of natural resources. To become this iconic figure, Paul will have to master the ways of the Fremen. The more that Paul learns the ways of the desert, and the better he does in his guerrilla war against the Harkonnens, the more the Fremen end up actually believing that he genuinely is the Lisan al-Galib. Paul's character changes to a leading role. No longer is he responding to other people and running away, but now he's taking action and forcing the world to respond to him. At one point in the movie, after drinking the water of the life and being able to see into the future, he goes full mask off and takes up the mantle of being some kind of warlord with one of the best speeches I've heard in a long ass time. And while this heel turn does feel kind of fast and out of nowhere, the way that Timothée Chalamet delivers the speech really does genuinely make you believe that Paul is the man that he says he is. Stilgar was one of my favorite characters in the movies. While he was portrayed to be a religious fanatic, there were some layers to his character. He acts as a mentor character to Paul, who still doesn't know how to survive in the desert. He also has a natural charisma to his character. Stilgar is funny and often chews up all the scenes that he's in. Shani is an interesting character. She's not just a generic love interest. She's a Fremen, but she's not a part of the religious southern sect of the people. She doesn't believe that Paul is the Lisan al-Ghalib, but instead sees him as a real person. Her relationship with Paul feels more natural and real since she doesn't put him on a pedestal. She sees him for who he is. And the relationship she has with Paul is authentically communicated by seeing the two work together throughout the movie. Shani also has an important role in the story. She serves as a foil to go against characters like Jessica, Stilgar, and even Gurney to a lesser extent, who want to force Paul into this godlike leadership position. She's often the voice of reason in a lot of scenes, and unfortunately she gets shut down half the time. Again, pretty interesting character here. Gurney makes a triumphant return in this movie. While he was Paul's old mentor, he takes on a different role in this movie. He's just another force that points Paul on the path to ruling the Freemen as a religious type of figure, although Gurney takes it from a different approach. He doesn't genuinely believe that Paul is the Lisan al-Ghalib, but he sees the political utility of having him take up that role. He's a secular force that is pushing Paul into that position of power. Jessica, on the other hand, is a pretty interesting character. Like, I don't know if she's pushing Paul in the direction she's pushing him because she's an overbearing mother, or because at one point in the movie, she genuinely actually believes in the propaganda that she's been peddling. Like, I think after she drinks the water of the life, she starts to actually believe that Paul is the Lisan al-Ghalib. Again, I haven't read the books, but that's kind of the vibe I was getting from watching the movie. And now, let's get into the villains. Vladimir Harkonnen. While the guy is cartoonishly evil, the Baron chews up the scene every time he's on camera. My only real complaint about the Baron is that we just don't ever get enough screen time of him. The Baron has lived a life of excess. He devours food like he's some kind of Roman hedonist, to the point that he can no longer walk anymore. He floats around in his chair like he's Dr. Eggman, or he just uses his gravity propulsion system in service of walking. It's also heavily implied that his sexual perversion is so bad, it'll get this video demonetized. Despite the fact that the Baron embodies all these vices, he's still competent and ruthless in the pursuit of power. And this is what makes him so dangerous. And I just love the performance played on display here. I just wish we had more of the guy in the movie. I want more dialogue from the Baron. I just love that voice and the way he talks. Fade Ratha makes his first appearance in this movie and gets a whole 25 minutes dedicated to setting up his character. And Fade is like a combination of Vladimir Harkonnen and Raban. He's young and has all the combat and power of Raban, but he also retains Vladimir's cunning mind and sexually perverse appetite, but somehow even in a worse way. He kind of has this cannibalism thing going on for him. He's meant to be the ultimate foil to Paul in this movie, while Raban is fairly incompetent by comparison. Really, Raban just exists in this movie to give Dave Bautista some work. And now I just kind of want to gush about the cinematography and the visual effects. I just want to get into how the movie ended up looking. And this movie was directed by Denis Villeneuve, and the cinematography was done by Greg Fraser. And these guys went all out in this movie. What we have here is a brilliant combination of shooting on location, like they actually shot scenes in the desert, combined with groundbreaking and innovative visual effects for this movie. And I kind of feel like every scene in Dune Part 2 looks like the best desert scenes from Raiders of the Lost Ark. And I really do mean that. And we're just firing off of that energy for the entire duration of the movie. And Dune 2 is like almost 3 hours long. Like, it's a long movie. some of my favorite shots in Dune 2 was whenever Paul was contrasted behind the desert. Like, the most iconic scene for me was when Paul arrives in the South the first time after drinking the water of life. And at this point in the movie, his character is completely different. And when we see him walking in the distance, he's kind of showcased like a mirage in the distance with a sandworm diving into the background. And this communicates so much to the viewer. Like, the fact that a sandworm is bowing beneath him, like it's just diving behind him, makes it seem like he has authority and domain of his surroundings. And the fact he comes off as a mirage, like he's fading in and out of the background, gives him an otherworldly godlike aura. Like, the imagery deliberately makes Paul look like he genuinely is the Lisan al-Ghalib, and there are too many scenes like this to count in the movie. And one thing that Denis Villeneuve and Greg Fraser really land this time around is just how otherworldly and alien the universe feels in Dune 2. Like, this universe doesn't really look like any science fiction movie to date. There's this scene at the beginning of the movie when the Harkonnen shock troopers just kind of out of nowhere activate their anti-gravitational devices and they just start floating in the air, and it sets a mood right from the get-go. Like, this is a universe where things can just kind of happen. And the iconic scene where Paul Atreides rides a sandworm is phenomenal, and it really shouldn't be. It shouldn't be, because a sandworm is just supposed to be a generic stand-in for a dragon. I think Frank Herbert has said that in interviews, and conceptually speaking, it's a lame stand-in for a dragon, because a dragon is a giant armored dinosaur that can breathe fire. And what is a sandworm? A kaiju earthworm that looks like a giant turd and eats people with a whale mouth. Like, it really shouldn't work. But in this movie, it does work, because sandworms somehow are now way cooler than a dragon, and I want to ride them. Like, the riding scene should have looked lame as hell, but it just works. It works because it feels real. Some of this could be thanks to the sound design. Like, there is this heavy bass rumbling that feels like the sandworm is gigantic. It gives a genuine sense of scale when the bass hits you and you see it arise from the sand dunes. And there's also a good visual mix of mixing in a real rig alongside good visual effects. And then we have to get into how the scene was directed. Like, one of the reasons why this scene feels so real is that from a video game perspective, it almost looks like it's an over-the-shoulder third-person perspective, like Resident Evil. And it's about as close you can get to a first-person perspective without going there. And the sound feels good, and the sand is like blasted forward in front of the camera, like you could hear the wind, and it feels real. And like, it felt like, to me, like the one time I drove a buggy around during an excursion, like, it was just that amazing. And this is all thanks to good directing by Denis Villeneuve and Greg Fraser. But the best scene in this movie, like when I really realized that Dune 2 was freaking amazing, was the Getty Prime gladiator scene. For starters, this entire sequence is shot in infrared. And for those that don't know, infrared kind of makes everything in black and white. And it kind of gives everything an alien look, where people's skin looks kind of soft and baby-like, and light kind of bounces off them and they look all kind of weird. And the way the scene is shot and directed just looks amazing. Like, when the gladiatorial door opens and they start chanting Fade Ratha's Seed, combined with the amazing soundtrack by Hans Zimmer and the bass, like, it really felt like the first time I went to a jiu-jitsu tournament, and I felt the tension in the air. Like, that's kind of the vibe I felt. I loved the costume design. Like, you see these weird gimped up matador looking dudes walking around in the background, and they kind of emerge from the shadows because they're kind of camouflaged into the walls in the background that are black. And the fight scene is amazing. And Fade Ratha has these weird, disgusting black teeth, and when he smiles, it makes him look kind of demonic. This entire scene was amazing. And again, like I said earlier, like, I think I even said this out loud when I saw this scene. I was like, this movie is amazing. Like, it was an epiphany moment, and it just came to me that I just knew that I was going to be blown away. And this movie was pretty fantastically paced. Like, I gotta say, like, I watched it 3 times in a row, and that just goes to show you that, unlike the first movie, the pacing for Dune 2 is really good. Like, again, the fact that I could see this in 3 viewings, borderline back to back, like, I think some of them may have been spaced a day, and this movie is like 3 hours long, just goes to show you about how well and how competently it was directed, and how well the story was crafted. And finally, let's get into the music here. The soundtrack was done by Hans Zimmer, and Hans is firing off of all cylinders in this movie. Now again, I'm in no shape or form a music critic. I kind of don't know what to say here, but I will say if you enjoyed his work in The Dark Knight or any other of his movies, this is definitely his best work here. It is a little bass heavy, like to get the most out of this soundtrack, you are going to need a good setup, like you're going to need a good speakers, a home theater setup, good headphones, etc., etc. It's just not going to hit you as well unless you can really feel that bass flowing through you. And now I want to get into the conclusion here. And unlike the conclusion to a lot of my videos, I actually have something I want to say here. The reason why Dune 2, especially combined with Part 1, is so good is because all of the people working on this movie genuinely liked and respected the source material. Like Hans Zimmer turned down working with Christopher Nolan to work on Dune 2. Like, this is a passion project for this guy. And Denis Villeneuve has been working on Dune for his entire life. Like, even when this man was a child, he was out there creating drafts in scripts to how you would direct Dune as a movie franchise. And it just goes to show that this love and respect to the source material ended up translating into a really good movie where people all put an effort to make sure that this was high art on the screen. For a long time now, people have been asking whether we'd get this generation's version of Star Wars or Lord of the Rings, and I'm happy to say it's here. And it's a return to form because, ironically, Dune was created before Star Wars, and it's kind of ironic that once again, Dune, what a series that was at one point sidelined for Star Wars, is now taking up the mantle of being one of the most popular and best movies you could see right now. And I kind of find that there's some poetic justice in that happenstance. That being said, I'm the Gaming Grappler. Please like, comment, and subscribe to this channel. I do need all the help I can get. The more you guys engage with my content, the better my channel does, and the more time, effort, and dedication I could bring into delivering you guys content on a consistent and regular basis. With that being said, have a good one, everybody.